Watch the previous video to understand the essence of what is happening. When Daniel Brooks stepped off the small, creaking boat and onto the mainland, he was no longer the man who had escaped from that cold, rotting cell. His prison jumpsuit had been buried in the sand of the island, along with the last shreds of his old identity. The battered duffel bag on his shoulder hung heavy with the remnants of a smuggler's fortune, cash, gold coins, and gemstones that glinted with the promise of a new life. He called himself David Shaw now. It was a name without history, clean and crisp, a sharp blade ready to cut through the underbrush of society. His first weeks on the outside were a blur of cheap motels and long bus rides, slipping through small towns and back alleys. He moved with the quiet paranoia of a hunted man, but with each passing day, the weight of his old life loosened its grip. He settled in Boston, where anonymity thrived. The city's labyrinth of old brick buildings and bustling streets offered him cover. He rented a small, unfurnished apartment and began the meticulous process of building his new identity. He forged documents, opened accounts, and fed his wealth through a network of shell companies. Within months, David Shaw emerged as a quiet but ambitious investor. Money spoke, and Daniel, or rather, David, learned to let it do most of the talking. He frequented charity galas, art exhibitions, and exclusive clubs, always the man at the edge of the room, just interesting enough to be invited back but never revealing too much. His calm demeanor, sharp suits, and well-placed donations opened doors that a prison uniform never could. The first time he saw them, his old friends, it was at a high-society fundraiser in a grand ballroom with crystal chandeliers and live classical music. The room hummed with polite laughter and the clink of champagne glasses. David stood by the edge of a marble staircase, his hand resting casually on the banister, when his gaze landed on Richard Kane. Richard looked older, his hair thinning and his waistline softened by years of indulgence. But his face, with its sharp features and practiced smile, was unmistakable. He moved through the crowd with a politician's ease, shaking hands and trading hollow pleasantries. Daniel's blood ran cold, but his face remained a mask of mild interest. He took a slow sip of his drink, allowing the ice to clink softly against the glass. Richard Kane, the man who had signed the letter that damned him, the architect of his betrayal. Not far behind, Daniel spotted Lucas Grant, now a financial executive with a tailored suit and a smirk that hadn't aged a day. And there was Mark Ellis, the local prosecutor turned city councilman, his voice booming as he regaled a small crowd with some embellished story. The puzzle pieces clicked into place. Richard, Lucas, and Mark, the trifecta of betrayal. They had built their careers on the ashes of his life. They stood there, basking in their success, utterly unaware that their reckoning had just walked through the door. Daniel moved through the room, his presence a shadow. He introduced himself as David Shaw, a hedge fund manager with a knack for spotting opportunities. His voice was warm, his handshake firm. The men welcomed him eagerly, their greed flaring at the scent of fresh capital. And then, there she was. Emily. She was standing by the windows, her silhouette framed by the city lights. Her dark hair spilled over her shoulders, and her laughter, soft and genuine, cut through the hum of the party. She turned, and Daniel felt his heart twist. Time had changed her, etched fine lines around her eyes, but she was still Emily, the girl he had planned to marry, the girl he had dreamed of in the darkness of his cell. But now, her hand rested lightly on the arm of Richard Kane. The glint of a wedding ring caught the light, and Daniel's stomach churned. He forced himself to breathe, to keep the mask in place. When their eyes met, he saw it, a flicker of recognition, a ghost of the past brushing against the present. Emily's smile faltered, and she looked away, her expression tightening. Daniel didn't approach her. Not yet. He slipped away from the party, his mind already weaving the threads of his plan. His enemies had built their lives on his ruin. They had twisted the truth, carved out pieces of his soul, and left him to rot. Now, it was his turn. And he would not fail. David Shaw became a fixture in Boston's upper circles. His ascent was subtle but steady, each step meticulously calculated. He invested in real estate, acquired a modest tech startup, and donated generously to local charities. His name appeared in society pages, his face in photos where he stood just behind the real stars of the night, never too visible, but never entirely hidden. The same circles, inevitably, included Richard Kane, Lucas Grant, and Mark Ellis. Their world was a tapestry of polished smiles and whispered deals, and David became a weaver of that tapestry, threading himself into their lives. He started with Lucas. The man had always been ambitious, a gambler with a penchant for high-risk investments. David approached him over whiskey at a smoky, dimly lit bar that only men in suits seemed to know about. "I've got an opportunity," David said, swirling his glass, the amber liquid catching the low light. "A property development deal. Quiet, under the radar. Big returns." Lucas leaned in, his eyes bright with greed. "I'm listening." David played his part perfectly, the charming newcomer with just enough mystery to be intriguing. He outlined a plan, a fabricated development in a booming neighborhood, complete with falsified documents and forged architectural plans. The investment required cash, of course, and Lucas eagerly funneled funds into the venture, siphoning them through his company to avoid scrutiny. Weeks passed, and David spun his web. He leaked hints to financial regulators, crafted anonymous tips, and slowly turned the screws. When the investigation dropped, it hit hard. Lucas's accounts were frozen, his company's stock plummeted, and the board of directors ousted him overnight. The man who had once smirked over Daniel's downfall now sat slumped on a park bench, his tie askew, muttering into his phone as his life crumbled. But David didn't stop there. He approached Mark Ellis next, feeding him information about Lucas's supposed illegal dealings, stoking the prosecutor's ambition. Mark, ever the opportunist, seized the chance to bring down a high-profile executive, unaware he was merely a pawn in a larger game. Through it all, David maintained his facade, supportive, genuine, the friend offering a shoulder to cry on. He whispered just enough to guide their choices, his hands never appearing dirty. His relationship with Richard Kane took more finesse. Richard wasn't as easily baited by money or career prospects. His strength was his family, his polished image as a devoted husband and philanthropist. And so, David began to erode that foundation. He became a confidant to Emily. It started with polite conversations at events, sharing quiet corners and glasses of wine. She seemed drawn to him, her eyes lingering a moment too long, her laughter softer when he was near. The recognition was there, buried under years and the new lines on his face, but it pulsed beneath the surface. One rainy afternoon, they found themselves alone in a glass-walled gallery, surrounded by muted paintings and the soft patter of rain. "You remind me of someone," she said, her voice delicate as if speaking too loudly might break the moment. David held her gaze, his expression a careful blend of curiosity and distance. "Good memories, I hope." She hesitated. "Mostly." Her eyes shone with something unspoken, a longing, a fracture in her perfect life. David didn't press, but he planted the seed. He let her believe what she wanted, let her doubts about Richard simmer. He knew Richard wasn't faithful, that his business trips were often spent in the company of younger, blonder women. David made sure Emily found out, not through him, of course, but through a carefully orchestrated chain of whispers. Richard's world began to unravel. Emily confronted him, and their arguments seeped through the thin walls of their luxury townhouse. The neighbors talked. The tabloids sniffed out the scandal. The charity board quietly asked Richard to step down, not wanting a public spectacle. And David was always there, a steady presence, a friend who understood. Behind the scenes, he tightened his grip. He acquired shares in Richard's crumbling ventures through proxies, whispered to investors about shady deals, and watched as Richard's empire began to buckle. Each victory was a quiet triumph, a small stone laid on the path toward retribution. And yet, amidst the calculated moves and silent victories, there was Emily, the one variable he couldn't control. Her presence brought an ache he thought he'd buried. When she looked at him, the mask slipped, just a fraction. But he couldn't afford love. Not now. Justice came first. And as David sat alone in his dim apartment, surrounded by the meticulous notes of his revenge, he knew the game was far from over. The noose was tightening. And he was the one pulling the rope. It was only a matter of time before Richard Kane's life began to collapse under the weight of David Shaw's calculated moves. The man who had once stood at the pinnacle of society, admired by all for his success and charm, was now fighting a battle on all fronts. David watched from the shadows as Richard's carefully constructed empire crumbled. The press painted him as a man of moral ambiguity, even as his financial missteps bled into his personal life. The public whispers grew louder, and the cracks in Richard's perfect facade became impossible to ignore. It was Emily who finally confronted him, just as David had orchestrated. One evening, after a particularly vicious confrontation over one of Richard's infamous business trips, she stood in front of him, her eyes clouded with confusion and hurt. "I know," she said, her voice steady, but the pain in it cut through the air like a blade. "I know what you've been doing. The lies. The women." Richard froze, his face draining of color. His usual arrogance melted away, replaced by the defensive panic of a man caught in his own web. "Emily, listen, it's not like—" "No, Richard," she interrupted. "Don't lie to me anymore. I've known for months. All the secrets you've tried so hard to keep. You're not the man I thought you were." David had placed the seeds of doubt in Emily's mind long before this confrontation. He had fed her small pieces of information, enough to make her question the life she had built with Richard. And now, she stood on the precipice of choosing herself over him. As the days passed, Richard's empire continued to fracture. Emily distanced herself, spending more time with David, who, ever the attentive friend, was always ready to lend an ear. In those quiet moments between them, when Richard's world seemed to unravel even further, Emily's feelings for David began to shift. The man she had once known as the love of her life had become a stranger, and in his place, the quiet strength of David began to fill the gaps Richard had left behind. But David knew his path, and love, though tempting, was a distraction he couldn't afford. His plan was nearing completion. It was time for the final pieces to fall into place. Meanwhile, Lucas Grant, the financial executive who had been ruined by David's quiet manipulation, had been hiding from the public eye. His fortunes had collapsed, his reputation in tatters. His once gilded life was now a series of failed attempts to restore his wealth, each more desperate than the last. David tracked him down, not in the public eye, but in the shadows of a seedy hotel just outside the city. Lucas, now a broken man, had nowhere left to hide. David found him in a dingy bar, drowning in whiskey, his hands trembling. The man who had once reveled in his power now clung to whatever dignity he had left. David approached him, calm and deliberate. "Lucas," he said softly, "how's life treating you?" Lucas's eyes flickered with recognition, followed by a flash of terror. He knew exactly who David was, the man whose life he had ruined. The man whose betrayal had put him on this path to ruin. "Get away from me," Lucas mumbled, his voice hoarse. "I have nothing left." David leaned in, his voice cold. "You have your pride, Lucas. But even that's fading, isn't it? You see, I didn't just take your money. I took your life. And now, I'm here to finish what I started." It wasn't physical punishment David sought, not yet. No, he would break Lucas psychologically, just as he had broken him. He would expose Lucas's financial crimes to the few remaining investors who trusted him. He would ensure that the last shred of Lucas's reputation crumbled. The next morning, Lucas's name appeared on the front page of a financial magazine, his face a mask of shame as he was implicated in a massive insider trading scandal. Within hours, his bank accounts were frozen, his assets seized. He was left with nothing but his broken reputation, and that was far worse than any monetary loss. David's grip was tightening. The final player was about to fall. Mark Ellis, the prosecutor who had once sealed his fate, had begun to make waves in local politics, riding on the back of his clean record and his supposed commitment to justice. But in the quiet halls of city council, his own skeletons rattled against the closet door. David had made sure of that. Mark's affair with a colleague, one that had long been kept under wraps, was suddenly leaked to the press, an anonymous tip that painted him as a hypocrite, a man who had built his career on prosecuting criminals while hiding his own transgressions. David didn't just ruin his reputation, he made sure the scandal stuck to him like tar, slowly suffocating him from the inside out. But that wasn't enough for David. No, he wanted Mark to feel the full weight of the law he had once wielded so eagerly against him. He sent a carefully crafted dossier to the FBI, detailing Mark's illicit activities. By the time the authorities arrived at his door, Mark's world had already been shredded. The fall from grace was swift. The man who had once been untouchable was now facing criminal charges of his own. As David watched the pieces of his enemies' lives disintegrate, he couldn't help but feel a pang of something he hadn't expected: satisfaction. The justice was, at last, complete. But there was still one final loose end. David's plan had come to fruition. Richard, Lucas, and Mark, once powerful, influential men, were all but broken. Their reputations lay in ruins, their fortunes scattered to the winds like dust. But for David, the final piece of the puzzle remained. The one person who could still feel like a loose thread in the tapestry of revenge: Emily. She had started distancing herself from Richard long before the final blow fell. David's subtle manipulations had worn her down. The moments of shared grief, the quiet, understanding words of encouragement he had offered, all of it had opened the door for Emily to see Richard for what he truly was. A fraud. A liar. But despite her growing doubts about Richard, there was still something in Emily that clung to the past. She had loved Richard. She had once believed in the future they'd planned together, and that love wasn't easily erased. David had made sure to keep his distance, never pushing too hard, always a shadow lurking in the background. But it had worked. Richard's own actions, his infidelities, his deceit, had pushed Emily to the brink. She had left him. The headlines were filled with the dissolution of their marriage, but there was no mention of the reasons behind it, no hint at the ugliness that had driven it. And yet, despite everything, Emily still found herself seeking solace in David. They spent more time together. Long walks in the park, quiet dinners at small, intimate restaurants. There was a certain comfort between them, a shared history that David couldn't deny. One evening, as they sat on a secluded bench in a small park overlooking the city, Emily turned to him, her face bathed in the soft light of the setting sun. Her eyes were distant, but there was a softness to them, a vulnerability that had never been there before. "David," she began, her voice hesitant, "I don't know what to believe anymore. Everything's changed so much. My life, it feels like it's all falling apart." David looked at her, his heart tightening. He couldn't help but feel the weight of her words. For all his plotting, all his manipulation, a part of him had always cared for her. And yet, the path he had chosen was one that demanded sacrifice. "You don't have to figure everything out tonight," he said, his voice calm but filled with the knowledge of the truth that he had hidden for so long. "But you're not alone in this. You never have been." Emily looked at him, her gaze searching his face. "But you've always been there. I don't understand why." David paused. It wasn't time to reveal everything, not yet. He had one final step in his plan. But the truth of his feelings for her, buried deep beneath the layers of his revenge, was becoming harder to ignore. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm here because I understand what you're going through. I understand betrayal. I understand loss. For a moment, it seemed as though Emily would say something more, but instead, she simply nodded. She seemed to accept the silence, as if the weight of their shared history spoke louder than any words. The next few days were a blur of events. Mark Ellis's career had imploded, and Richard's legal battles intensified. Lucas was facing criminal charges, his assets drained. The men who had once sealed David's fate were now drowning in their own hubris. They had all but disappeared from public view. David, however, remained in the background, always the steady figure, always the calm before the storm. And then, the final piece of his plan fell into place. Richard Kane, broken and bitter, reached out to him. He had nowhere left to turn. His empire was gone, his wife gone, his reputation in tatters. David took the call in a dimly lit office, the weight of his own silence pressing in on him. He let Richard speak first. "I know what you've done," Richard's voice crackled over the line. "I know you're behind everything. The investigation, the leaks, everything. You've destroyed my life." David's expression didn't change. "You did that yourself, Richard. You signed the papers. You made the deals. You played the game. I just made sure you lost." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Richard spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "I want to meet you. I want to fix this. Whatever it takes." David almost laughed. The desperation in Richard's voice was palpable, a man grasping for anything to save him from the wreckage of his life. "I don't think you can fix anything," David replied, his tone icy. "But we can meet. And I'll show you exactly how far you've fallen." They met the next evening, in a small, dimly lit cafe at the edge of the city. The place was nearly empty, save for a few lonely patrons who barely glanced at them. Richard, now disheveled and gaunt, sat across from David, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the coffee cup. "You think you've won, don't you?" Richard spat, his anger seeping through his words. "I didn't win, Richard. I just played by the rules you set," David replied coolly, watching Richard squirm. The tension in the room was thick, almost palpable. David had every right to gloat, to press his advantage, but he didn't. He'd already won. Richard's defeat had already been written, sealed in the choices he'd made long ago. "I want you to know, I never intended for this," Richard said, his voice quieter now. "I never wanted you to be destroyed. You were my friend." David's eyes hardened. "You never saw me as a friend, Richard. You used me, like you used everyone else. You destroyed my life for your own gain." Richard hung his head, as if realizing too late the magnitude of his betrayal. There was no redemption for him now. And in that moment, as Richard continued to fall further from grace, David knew it was time. He had delivered the final blow, and with it, his enemies were no more than ghosts in the rearview mirror. David Shaw had won. But the cost was steep, the weight of revenge hung heavily over David, like a storm cloud threatening to burst. He had destroyed the lives of his enemies, Richard, Lucas, Mark. He had orchestrated their falls from grace with the precision of a maestro conducting an orchestra. But something was gnawing at him. Something wasn't finished. David had spent years in prison, surviving the darkness, the hunger, the madness, only to rise from it all with a singular purpose, to make them pay. But now, with his enemies broken and their careers shattered, David felt the emptiness of success. The grand plan had been executed flawlessly, and yet, there was no sense of peace, no triumph. Only the weight of his own decisions. Emily. The woman who had once been his light in the dark, the woman whose love he had never truly been able to erase from his heart. Despite all he had done, she remained an enigma, someone whose affections were no longer a certainty, but whose presence in his life was still a fixture. David had pushed her away for years, convincing himself that his pursuit of vengeance was all that mattered. But now, with everything falling into place, he could no longer deny the ache in his chest when he thought of her. Emily had been through so much. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the pain of losing Richard, the man who had once promised her the world. But in the quiet moments they had spent together, David saw a flicker of something else. Something real. He had kept her at arm's length for so long, but now, the truth of his feelings, no matter how inconvenient, was undeniable. It was time to face her, to let her decide for herself what her future would look like. But when David arrived at her apartment, he was greeted with an unexpected sight. Emily was there, standing in the doorway, her eyes swollen from crying. "I'm sorry, David," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't want it to end like this. I didn't want to hurt you." David's heart sank. He didn't know what to say. He had always feared this moment, when the lines between his quest for revenge and his love for Emily would blur. "I didn't want this either," he said, his voice hoarse. "But I couldn't stop myself. I couldn't let them get away with what they did to me." Emily's gaze softened, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of the years had finally caught up with her. "I know, David. I understand. But you've hurt so many people along the way. You've hurt me." The word stung, but David knew she was right. He had been so focused on his revenge that he hadn't stopped to think about the collateral damage. Emily had been caught in the middle of it all. For a long moment, they stood there, the silence between them deafening. Finally, Emily spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "I can't be with you, David. I can't be with someone who's still so consumed by this. I need peace. I need to find myself again. And I can't do that with you." David's chest tightened. The last vestige of his past life, the woman he had once loved, was slipping away from him. But he knew, deep down, that she was right. "Goodbye, Emily," he whispered, turning away. But just as he reached the door, Emily's voice stopped him. "David," she called softly. He turned back to her, the weight of everything pressing down on him. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she said, her voice shaky but resolute. "But I can't be a part of it." And with that, David left. The door closed softly behind him, and for the first time in years, he felt truly alone. David had destroyed his enemies. He had orchestrated their fall from grace, had watched them crumble under the weight of his revenge. But in doing so, he had lost the one thing that had once made him feel human, love. Now, as the dust settled and the remnants of his past life faded away, David was left with only one thing, freedom. But freedom was a bitter thing. It came at the cost of everything he had once held dear. He was rich, powerful, and untouchable, but he was alone. And for the first time, David realized that vengeance, while sweet in the moment, could never truly fill the void. The world had moved on, and so had Emily. David Shaw stood at the precipice of a new life, a life without the ghosts of his past haunting him. The revenge was over, the enemies defeated. There was nothing left but to walk away. And as he walked into the city, the sun setting behind him, David finally understood what true peace was: letting go. Letting go of the past. Letting go of the anger. He had won, but at what cost? And now, it was time to fade into the shadows, to disappear and live the rest of his life on his own terms. With the treasure he had gathered, David could live in luxury, but he knew he would never find peace if he didn't find a way to forgive himself. And so, with the millions in his pocket, and the ghosts of the past fading behind him, David Shaw disappeared. No longer the man driven by vengeance, he left behind a world that had once been his, and walked away into the unknown, where he could finally find the quiet he had been searching for all along. David Shaw had become a ghost in the city. His name was now just a whisper in the wind, the remnants of his vengeance fading into the past. No one knew where he had gone or what had happened to the once feared man who had brought down his enemies with such cold precision. But David didn't care. He had erased himself from the world, choosing to live in the shadows he had once controlled. For the first time in years, he felt free. The treasure he had uncovered, riches beyond anything he could have imagined, provided him with everything he could need. The mansion in the hills, the luxury cars, the designer clothes, it was all at his fingertips. But none of it mattered. David didn't want to be seen. He didn't want the world to recognize him. He had learned the painful truth that no amount of money, no amount of power, could replace the peace that came with letting go of the past. David spent his days in seclusion, the world outside a blur. He read books, studied art, and traveled in silence, never staying in one place too long. He took on new identities, moved through life like a shadow, and avoided any connections with the people who had once known him. But the darkness never fully left. One day, as David wandered the streets of a small coastal town in the Pacific Northwest, he found himself standing before a familiar building, an old bookstore tucked away on a quiet corner. The faded sign above the door read, "The Lost Pages." It was a place he had visited long ago, before everything had fallen apart. Before the prison, the betrayal, and the vengeance. David's heart skipped a beat as he pushed open the door. The smell of old books and dust greeted him, a scent that brought back memories of simpler times. He walked slowly down the narrow aisles, his fingers brushing the spines of the books, lost in the nostalgia of it all. And then, there she was. Emily. Her presence was like a punch to the gut. He hadn't seen her in years, but there she was, standing at the counter, her eyes scanning the pages of a book she held in her hands. She was older now, but the familiar spark in her eyes hadn't faded. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The world around them disappeared, and all that remained was the weight of their shared history. Emily looked up, her gaze locking with David's. Her expression was unreadable at first, but then something shifted, something unspoken passed between them. She hadn't forgotten. "David," she said softly, her voice carrying a mix of surprise and something else, something deeper. "I didn't expect to see you here." David's heart raced. He hadn't planned on this, hadn't even considered the possibility of running into her again. But here she was, standing before him, and for a moment, he was just a man who had lost everything but the memories. "I didn't expect to see you either," he said, his voice hoarse, betraying the emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in so long. Emily set the book down and walked toward him, her eyes searching his face. There was a moment of silence, and then she spoke again. "I thought you were gone. I thought you'd disappeared forever." David smiled faintly, his expression wry. "In a way, I have. I've let go of the past." Emily nodded slowly, her gaze softening. "I see that. But I don't know if I can ever understand what you did. What you became." David looked at her, his chest tight with emotions he hadn't dealt with. "I did what I thought I had to. And for a long time, it felt like the only way forward." She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing her words. "But you're not that person anymore, are you?" David shook his head. "No, I'm not. I've learned that revenge doesn't give you peace. It just leaves you with more emptiness." For a long moment, Emily didn't say anything. She simply looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time. "Then what now?" she asked quietly. David sighed, his gaze drifting out the window. The town was quiet, the sound of the waves crashing softly against the shore in the distance. He had no answers. He had no grand plan. All he had was the knowledge that the life he had led was over, and that he would never be able to go back to it. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I know I can't go on like this forever." Emily nodded, her eyes softening with understanding. "Neither can I. I don't know if there's a way forward for us, but I do know that I've spent too much time wondering what could have been. I've let go of that too." David looked at her, and for the first time in years, he felt something stir within him, hope. Not for the past, but for the possibility of something new. Something without the weight of the past holding them back. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. But for now, it was enough that they were here, together in this moment. In this quiet, uncertain place. David knew that he would never escape his past, but perhaps that was okay. Perhaps he didn't need to. All he needed now was the chance to live, for himself. For the future. As he walked out of the bookstore, the evening sun setting behind him, David realized that he was no longer running from the past. He had faced it, understood it, and learned from it. And now, he was free. David stood at the edge of the world. The setting sun cast a warm golden hue over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet. His eyes traced the delicate curve of the ocean below, where the waves crashed softly against the shore. For the first time in years, he felt no weight on his shoulders, no lingering anger in his heart. He had come full circle, gone from a man consumed by revenge to someone who had finally let it all go. The treasure, the power, the enemies, it had all been part of a life that no longer served him. Now, the world seemed quieter, softer, as if it had given him the gift of peace. As he stood there, a voice behind him broke the stillness. David. He turned to see Emily, her figure bathed in the fading light, walking toward him. Her presence was no longer an ache in his chest, but a gentle reminder of everything he had lost, and, perhaps, everything he could still gain. She stopped just a few steps away from him, her expression thoughtful, but no longer burdened by the pain of the past. She had healed, just as he had. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. David looked at her, searching her face for any sign of doubt, but there was none. She was here, now. They were here, together, at the crossroads of their lives. The years of separation, of mistakes, of vengeance, all felt like they were dissolving in the evening breeze. "Ready for what?" David asked, his voice steady, though his heart was beating faster than he expected. "To move on," Emily said simply. "To let go of everything that's held us back." David nodded slowly. He had learned that peace wasn't something you could force. It was something that came when you allowed yourself to live without the chains of the past. "I'm ready," he said quietly. And for the first time in a long time, he smiled, genuinely, without any trace of bitterness or regret. It wasn't the smile of a man who had won or lost. It was the smile of a man who had simply accepted life as it was, with all its imperfections. They stood together on that quiet hill, the waves below and the wind at their backs, as the night began to settle around them. David had sought revenge, had let it consume him, but now he knew, the real treasure, the real victory, was learning how to let go. To forgive himself and the world that had hurt him. And in that moment, as Emily stood beside him, he realized that maybe, just maybe, there was still hope for him after all. "Let's go," Emily said softly, taking his hand. David didn't look back. He didn't need to. His past had already faded into the distance, and ahead of him lay a future without revenge, without shadows, just the promise of a life that, for the first time, might finally be his own. This is the conclusion of David's journey. He has faced his demons, let go of his need for revenge, and found peace in the quiet simplicity of living. Though his past will always be a part of him, he now has the chance to create a new life, with or without Emily. The future, as it always does, remains unwritten. I hope this conclusion ties everything together for you. David's arc has come to a close, with him finally finding the peace he long sought after.